Ladies and gentlemen, imagine a place where justice came from the barrel of a gun, where survival meant outsmarting both nature and man, and where every sunrise could bring either fortune or death. Welcome to the American frontier, the wildest, most violent, lawless, and unpredictable chapter in U.S. history. The frontier wasn't just a stretch of land. It was a way of life. Between the early 1800s and the closing of the frontier in 1890, Americans pushed westward, chasing dreams, gold, and freedom. But with that ambition came chaos to eye in the vast, unsettled regions of the American frontier. There were few structured governments and even fewer professional law enforcement officers. Towns would often spring up overnight, especially during boom periods like gold rushes or the expansion of the railroad, and these new settlements had little to no infrastructure in place to maintain law and order. Local governance was virtually non-existent, and the closest federal authority could be hundreds of miles away. This power vacuum created an environment where law was defined not by legal codes, but by the will of the majority, or sometimes by the person with the fastest draw. In the absence of trained police or courts, communities often resorted to organizing their own justice systems. Vigilante groups, sometimes called citizens' committees or regulators, would form to deal with criminals or enforce moral standards. While these groups occasionally protected citizens from real threats, they were just as likely to be driven by bias, rumor, or personal vendettas. Accusations didn't require proof, only enough angry voices. Lynch mobs were not uncommon, and many people were hanged without a trial, sometimes for crimes as minor as theft or suspected cheating at cards. Montana's Vigilance Committee of the 1860s is one of the most notorious examples. With crime rampant in booming mining towns like Bannack and Virginia City, a group of self-appointed lawmen took it upon themselves to clean up the streets. They claimed to restore order, but over the course of a few months, they executed over 20 men without any formal charges or trials. Their actions reflected a grim reality of frontier life. Justice wasn't about fairness, it was about speed, intimidation, and survival. This lack of formal legal institutions and reliance on mob rule made the frontier especially dangerous and unpredictable. You never knew if the people who showed up to protect the peace might end up turning on you. It was a place where the rule of law was often replaced by the rule of fear, and that set the tone for the chaos that defined the Wild West. The American frontier was a breeding ground for outlaws, men who lived by their own rules, often surviving through robbery, violence, and deception. Among the most infamous of these were Jesse James and Billy the Kid, two names that became synonymous with the lawlessness of the Wild West. But what truly cemented their place in history wasn't just the crimes they committed. It was the culture of chaos that allowed them to thrive, and the way society turned them into legends. Jesse James began his criminal career after the Civil War, forming the James Younger Gang with his brother Frank and several Confederate veterans. They were not just robbers. They were calculated, fearless, and ruthless. Between 1866 and 1882, Jesse and his gang robbed over a dozen banks, stagecoaches, and trains, often in broad daylight, and occasionally with local support. In many regions, he was seen as a folk hero, especially in the South. Newspapers played a large role in this, sensationalizing his crimes and painting him as a kind of modern-day Robin Hood, even though there's little evidence he ever shared his loot with the poor. Billy the Kid, on the other hand, was the embodiment of youthful rebellion and violence. By the time he was 21, he had allegedly killed 21 men, although historians debate the accuracy of that number. His real name was Henry McCarty, and he was drawn into a life of crime at an early age, ultimately becoming a central figure in the Lincoln County War in New Mexico. Like Jesse James, Billy's fame was fueled by the press, dime novels, and later, films that romanticized his life as a gunslinger. even though he lived in a world where shooting first was often the only way to stay alive. What made the success and survival of these outlaws possible was the widespread violence and lack of effective law enforcement on the frontier. There were few reliable police forces, and many sheriffs were outgunned, outmanned, or corrupt. In some towns, outlaws had more influence than the law. Rewards were offered for their capture, but more often than not, they vanished into the vast wilderness or found shelter among sympathetic locals. The myth of the outlaw was born out of this instability. With no strong legal system, people were drawn to stories of individuals who stood outside the law and carved their own path. These men weren't just criminals. They were seen as symbols of defiance in a world where power belonged to those who could take it. Jesse James and Billy the Kid didn't just survive the frontier. They became icons of it, their legacies forever tied to the violent, unpredictable nature of the era. The discovery of gold in California in 1848 ignited one of the largest mass migrations in American history. By 1849, thousands of prospectors, known as 49ers, poured into the region, all chasing the promise of instant wealth. But the dreams of prosperity quickly gave way to a brutal reality. The mining towns that emerged almost overnight were some of the most dangerous and chaotic places on the American frontier. With no law, no order, and an influx of desperate, armed men, these towns became breeding grounds for violence, corruption, and bloodshed. In places like Deadwood, Virginia City, and Bodie, the air was thick with tension. Miners staked their claims wherever they could, often overlapping with someone else's land. With fortunes made or lost in a day, it was not uncommon for disputes over gold claims to erupt into deadly shootouts. Claim jumping, the act of stealing another person's mine or land, was rampant, and with no official courts in place, justice was often settled with fists, knives, or bullets. Armed guards were sometimes hired to protect lucrative sites, while others took justice into their own hands, forming posses or vigilante mobs to enforce their version of the law. Saloons, gambling halls, and brothels lined the main streets of these boomtowns, attracting an endless stream of gamblers, drifters, prostitutes, and con artists. Drinking and gambling were everyday activities, and violent brawls broke out frequently. Murders were so common in some areas that the dead were buried in makeshift cemeteries without names, just a wooden cross, if they were lucky. Bodie, California, for instance, was so violent that a young girl is said to have written in her diary, "Goodbye God, I'm going to Bodie." Law enforcement, if it existed at all, was overwhelmed or corrupt. Sheriffs and marshals were often elected by popular vote, making them vulnerable to bribery or intimidation. Some lawmen even turned a blind eye to crime in exchange for a cut of the profits. In many cases, local business owners funded private security or hired mercenaries to maintain order, not to protect the public, but to protect their investments. On top of human violence, miners also battled the unforgiving elements. Harsh winters, food shortages, disease, and hazardous working conditions made survival a daily challenge. When mixed with the volatile personalities of fortune hunters, these hardships only intensified the explosive atmosphere. These mining towns were raw, combustible environments where ambition collided with desperation, and the results were often deadly. They represent a perfect storm of greed, lawlessness, and survivalism that turned the American frontier into a powder keg waiting to explode. One of the most tragic and violent aspects of the American frontier was the long, relentless struggle between white settlers pushing westward and the indigenous peoples who had lived on the land for centuries. As settlers moved further into tribal territories, driven by the promise of land, gold, and opportunity, tension rapidly escalated into open warfare. The frontier became a constant battlefield, scarred by raids, massacres, and forced removals, often fueled by deep cultural misunderstandings, broken treaties, and government-sanctioned aggression. For Native American tribes, westward expansion was not just an intrusion, it was an existential threat. As railroads cut through their hunting grounds and homesteaders claimed sacred lands, indigenous communities were pushed into smaller, less hospitable areas. Treaties were made and then broken, often before the ink had even dried. Some tribes attempted diplomacy, but many were left with no choice but to defend their homes with force. The result was a decades-long series of bloody confrontations. Famous conflicts like the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876, where Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors annihilated General Custer's 7th Cavalry, became legendary. But behind the iconic battles were countless lesser-known skirmishes, ambushes, and retaliations that left trails of destruction across the plains and deserts. Settlers lived in constant fear of raids, while tribes braced for military campaigns that often targeted not just warriors but entire villages, including women, children, and the elderly. The Sand Creek Massacre in 1864 is one of the most horrifying examples. Colorado militia forces attacked a peaceful Cheyenne and Arapaho village at dawn, slaughtering over 150 people, most of them unarmed civilians. Similarly, the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890 marked a grim end to the Indian Wars, as U.S. troops killed more than 250 Lakota people, including women and children, in South Dakota. These were not isolated incidents. They were part of a larger pattern of systemic violence aimed at erasing Native American resistance and culture. Adding to the brutality, both sides often engaged in acts that shocked even their contemporaries. Scalping, mutilation, and the destruction of food supplies were used as weapons of psychological warfare. Entire communities were displaced, and the trauma left behind still resonates today. What made the frontier especially savage was not just the frequency of conflict, but the deeply personal and desperate nature of it. For many native tribes, this was a fight for their very survival. For settlers, it was a battle to conquer and tame what they saw as a hostile wilderness. The result was a relentless cycle of fear, violence, and revenge. These conflicts weren't just footnotes in American history. They were central to the story of how the West was won, and they revealed the true cost of manifest destiny. The frontier wasn't just wild because of lawlessness and gunslingers. It was wild because it was a place where two worlds collided, violently and tragically, with no easy resolution. In the American frontier, the idea of justice was more fantasy than reality. The rapid westward expansion left towns and territories growing faster than any organized system of law could keep up with settlers, prospectors, ranchers, and outlaws flooding into new areas daily. Law enforcement found itself constantly overwhelmed, poorly equipped, and frequently outmatched. The result was a volatile society where might often made right, and where the badge of a sheriff carried little weight without the firepower or reputation to back it up. In many frontier towns, there were only one or two appointed peacekeepers responsible for overseeing entire regions, sometimes hundreds of square miles in size. These lawmen were often former soldiers, bounty hunters, or even reformed criminals themselves, selected not for their legal expertise, but for their toughness. They were expected to maintain order in areas where chaos was the default and violence was just a part of life. With no support, few resources, and a population that didn't always respect authority, their task was nearly impossible. Compounding the problem was the issue of corruption. Many lawmen were underpaid or not paid at all, especially in smaller, remote towns. This financial desperation opened the door to bribes, favors, and outright criminal alliances. Some sheriffs turned a blind eye to brothels, gambling dens, or smuggling operations in exchange for protection or profit. In notorious towns like Tombstone and Dodge City, it wasn't uncommon for lawmen to be friends or enemies of the very criminals they were meant to apprehend. Loyalties shifted constantly, and the line between outlaw and officer was often blurred beyond recognition. Moreover, vigilante justice became a common substitute for the legal system. Frustrated with the inefficiency or corruption of official law enforcement, citizens frequently took matters into their own hands. Vigilante mobs would arrest, judge, and execute accused criminals without trial, often based on rumor, personal vendettas, or mob mentality. While some of these acts were driven by a desire to maintain order, many were fueled by revenge or fear, leading to countless unjust hangings and brutal lynchings. In such an environment, trust in the justice system eroded quickly. Trials were rushed, evidence was scarce, and juries could be easily swayed or intimidated. The idea of due process was almost non-existent in many parts of the frontier. The absence of trained judges, legal counsel, or standardized procedures meant that justice varied wildly from town to town, depending more on who held power than on any sense of fairness or legality. Even well-known lawmen like Wyatt Earp or Wild Bill Hickok walked the fine line between enforcing the law and exploiting it. Earp, for instance, was involved in gambling and business ventures that sometimes conflicted with his duties, while Hickok was known for his deadly efficiency with a gun just as much as his official role as marshal. The result was a society where survival often depended not on the law, but on alliances, intimidation, and reputation. Justice, in the true sense of the word, was not a right but a luxury, one that few could count on in the unpredictable and unforgiving world of the frontier. In the American frontier, the gun wasn't just a tool, it was a way of life. Every man, and many women, carried a firearm, not just for protection from wild animals or bandits, but because disputes were often settled not with words or courts, but with bullets. This gun culture was deeply embedded in frontier society, where personal honor, pride, and survival instincts often outweighed any respect for formal law. The sheer number of weapons in circulation, combined with the volatile temperament of many frontier settlers, created an atmosphere where violence was a constant threat and often the first response to conflict. Duels, shootouts, and barroom brawls weren't rare occurrences. They were part of the rhythm of daily life. Arguments over poker games, accusations of cheating, property disputes, or even perceived slights could escalate to gunfire in seconds. In many towns, it was common for the local undertaker to be one of the busiest people in the community. Saloon floors were frequently stained with blood, and gunfire echoing down dusty streets was as much a part of the frontier soundtrack as the clinking of whiskey glasses or the pounding of horses' hooves. The infamous quick-draw gunfight became one of the most romanticized and deadly symbols of the Old West. While Hollywood may have exaggerated the drama, real-life showdowns like the gunfight at the OK Corral in Tombstone, Arizona, were all too real. In this case, a bitter feud between lawmen like Wyatt Earp and outlaws such as the Clanton Gang resulted in a bloody, 30-second exchange of bullets that left 3 men dead. And it wasn't an isolated event. Stories like this played out in dozens of towns across the frontier, where grudges and reputations were paid for in blood. Part of what made gun violence so widespread was the lack of consistent regulation. With no national firearm laws and minimal local enforcement, nearly anyone could purchase or carry a gun. Many frontier towns tried to impose rules, such as requiring visitors to check their firearms upon entering, but these were difficult to enforce. Some people viewed such regulations as an attack on their personal freedom, a sentiment that continues to echo in American culture today. Guns also served as tools of intimidation and control. Landowners used them to scare off trespassers, business owners kept them under the counter, and traveling salesmen carried them for protection. Women, too, often learned to shoot out of necessity, especially in isolated homesteads where help was miles away. But while firearms provided a sense of security, they also raised the stakes of every confrontation. A drunken insult could end in a corpse on the floor. A misunderstanding on the trail could lead to a shootout under the open sky. The prevalence of personal justice, the idea that individuals had the right to defend their honor or settle disputes without legal mediation, only amplified the danger. Frontier culture encouraged toughness and self-reliance, and many people saw calling the sheriff as a sign of weakness. This belief created a society where violence was not only accepted, but often glorified. Songs, dime novels, and newspapers turned gunslingers into celebrities, further embedding the mythos of the gun-toting, justice-dispensing loner into the American imagination. The combination of easy access to firearms, deep-rooted individualism, and a weak legal system meant that every man was his own judge, jury, and executioner. This culture of retribution and immediate action turned the American frontier into a tinderbox, one spark away from deadly violence at any moment. The American frontier was the perfect breeding ground for outlaws, lawless, rugged, and sparsely patrolled. With vast, empty landscapes and a patchy legal system, criminals could vanish into the wilderness or ride into the next territory without fear of pursuit. The outlaws of the Old West weren't just petty thieves. They were bold, armed, and often organized into gangs that carried out daring heists that captured public imagination and stoked fear across the plains. These criminal groups, such as the James Younger Gang, the Dalton Gang, and Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch, became infamous for their violent tactics and theatrical exploits. They targeted banks, stagecoaches, and trains, symbols of wealth and expansion, often in daylight, with a combination of precision and brute force. A favorite target of frontier outlaws was the train. As the railroads expanded westward, they became lifelines for commerce and communication, making them ideal for high-stakes robberies. Gangs would board moving trains, force the engineer to stop, and then blow open safes or strongboxes with dynamite. These raids often took place miles from the nearest town, leaving little chance for law enforcement to intervene in time. Bank robberies were equally dramatic. Gangs would ride into a quiet town, guns drawn, take control of the local bank, and make off with thousands in gold, silver, or cash. Civilians caught in the middle were threatened or shot, and townspeople who tried to resist were frequently gunned down. Afterward, the robbers would scatter or retreat to hideouts in the hills, forests, or caves, often relying on local sympathizers or fellow outlaws to avoid capture. Posses might be formed to pursue them, but limited communication and the sheer size of the frontier worked heavily in the outlaws' favor. What made these criminals especially dangerous was their ability to evade justice repeatedly. The slow and inconsistent reach of the law, combined with bribery, fear, and occasionally local support, meant many outlaws lived long criminal careers before being caught, if they were ever caught at all. Jesse James, for example, robbed banks and trains for over a decade and developed a folk hero status in some communities, even as he left a trail of bodies behind him. His fame was so widespread that newspapers published embellished accounts of his exploits, casting him as a rebel or a Robin Hood figure, despite the blood on his hands. Some outlaws were former soldiers, Civil War veterans hardened by combat, and familiar with tactics that gave them an edge over poorly trained local lawmen. Others were drifters, gamblers, or career criminals who saw opportunity in the chaos and isolation of the frontier. They moved between territories, assuming false identities and exploiting jurisdictional gaps that prevented effective law enforcement coordination. Sheriffs might know the identity of a suspect, but without telegraphs, automobiles, or organized federal support, pursuing fugitives was often a futile task. Even when outlaws were captured, justice was uncertain. Juries could be intimidated, witnesses could disappear, and prisons were poorly secured. Escapes were common, and in some cases, criminals simply bribed their way to freedom. The lack of a centralized police force meant that many frontier communities had to rely on vigilantes or bounty hunters to track down and eliminate threats, leading to more violence and further blurring the line between justice and revenge. The sheer boldness and violence of these outlaw gangs, combined with their ability to evade capture and sometimes even gain public admiration, made them a defining element of the frontier's wildness. Their presence turned towns into battlegrounds, railroads into danger zones, and the everyday life of settlers into a gamble with fate. One of the most defining and turbulent aspects of the American frontier was the intense and often brutal conflict between Native American tribes and the wave of settlers and soldiers pushing westward. This wasn't simply a series of isolated skirmishes. It was a prolonged and bloody struggle for land, culture, and survival. The Western expansion, driven by manifest destiny and the belief that Americans were destined to settle from coast to coast, brought thousands of settlers directly into conflict with indigenous nations who had lived on the land for centuries. As railroads, homesteads, and military forts spread across the frontier, Native tribes were increasingly forced off their ancestral lands. Treaties were made and broken with stunning regularity, often favoring the interests of the U.S. government and its expansionist goals. The result was a cycle of forced removals, violent reprisals, and open warfare. Tribes such as the Lakota Sioux, Apache, Comanche, Cheyenne, and Nez Perce were among those who resisted most fiercely, fighting to protect their territory, way of life, and sovereignty. The violence was relentless and widespread. Settlers moving westward were often attacked in retaliation for encroachment, massacres, or broken treaties. In turn, the U.S. military responded with overwhelming force, launching campaigns to suppress resistance and force tribes onto reservations. These confrontations were not minor raids. They were full-scale battles marked by atrocities on both sides. Events like the Sand Creek Massacre in 1864, where Colorado militia slaughtered a peaceful Cheyenne village, or the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876, where a coalition of Native warriors led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse annihilated Custer's 7th Cavalry, became legendary both for their brutality and for how they symbolized the desperation and defiance of indigenous resistance. The unpredictability of this conflict added to the wildness of the frontier. Settlers could be attacked without warning. Military outposts could find themselves under siege. Women and children were not spared in the violence, and entire communities lived in fear of raids or military retaliation. For Native Americans, the constant pressure of invasion, the destruction of buffalo herds, a primary food and cultural source, and the trauma of displacement created a life defined by resistance and survival. Even after major defeats, many tribes continued to resist through guerrilla tactics, evasion, and flight. Leaders like Geronimo, a legendary Apache warrior, became infamous for repeatedly escaping capture and leading small bands of fighters across the desert, launching raids and evading thousands of troops for years. These prolonged campaigns showcased both the strategic resilience of Native fighters and the near-military occupation approach taken by the U.S. government to crush them. Moreover, the cultural and spiritual devastation experienced by Native nations during this period was profound. Sacred lands were desecrated, children were taken to boarding schools to be stripped of their language and identity, and traditional ways of life were outlawed. The violence of the frontier wasn't limited to bullets and arrows. It was also psychological, cultural, and systemic. This bitter, drawn-out war between indigenous peoples and the advancing forces of American expansion added a deeply tragic and complex layer to the frontier experience. It turned the West into a battlefield where no one was truly safe, and where entire communities, Native and settler alike, were shaped by violence, betrayal, and survival. In the end, the American frontier was not just a place. It was a crucible of chaos, ambition, and survival. It was a time when lawlessness reigned, justice was often delivered at the end of a gun, and the land itself seemed to resist the very people trying to tame it. From the blood-soaked battles between native tribes and the U.S. Army, to the fearless outlaws who defied law and order, to the rugged pioneers who gambled everything for a new life, the frontier era was as unpredictable as it was unforgettable. These historical truths don't just paint a picture of the past. They serve as a reminder of how wild, violent, and untamed the making of America truly was. And that, more than any myth or movie, is what made the frontier the wildest era in U.S. history.